Hello, everyone. My name is Mandy Davis, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the director of Trauma Informed Oregon. My work is focused on responding with individuals, families, and communities in response to trauma, as well as working with organizations to consider how our policies and practices and procedures either hinder or promote wellness, both for the workforce as well as for those we serve. This is a micro lesson. And the reason I want to say it that way is because I am aware of the capacity for many of those in the field of education, as well as other sectors, to take in new information right now. There's so much that we are holding and have been holding. So that's the intention of doing short lessons. But I also want to really speak to the limitation of that, right? So consider that I hope that you will take this as seed planting. This is incomplete on its own. It's intended to provide some ideas, some maybe different ways to think about things, and maybe just validation for what you already know. Give me grace through this. I am giving you a wealth of information in a small amount of time. There might be typos. I might jumble up my words. So if something doesn't land right or you want to know more information, by all means, be in touch. Know that you are the expert of your work. So take any ideas or language or words that I use and put it through the filter of you and who you serve, modify it so it's culturally responsive and accountable and linguistically appropriate. And it makes sense based on the role that you serve within the education world. This is not intended as a directive or a mandate. If at any point this feels burdensome to you, stop listening. It is intended to be helpful. So please take away any little things that feel like they resonate with you and know that you'll take away that which you need. The how we do things is really important and is at the core of the work I do around trauma-informed care. So any of these ideas, stop and say, okay, interesting idea. What do I need to think about? How do you center race in the way that you do that idea or implement that idea? So think about centering race and equity, inclusion, and utilize your tools and practices that you have been learning or have around things that are restorative, trauma-informed, inclusive, healing-centered, and developmentally appropriate. As we go through this, I'd like to ask you to think about listening for the why. These are things I'm bringing forth because it's in the why that's the important part. Even though the why is a hard thing to hold on to when we're experiencing toxic stress, we just want to know what to do, and that I completely appreciate. So I'm trying to do a little bit of both. But if you're in the position to hear the why, the reason that's important is then you can bring your creativity and your strength to how it gets done. All right, so this micro lesson is on thinking about the pathways for healing or the healing process and how it could be applied to reopening and re-engaging with children and families in the education sector. There are four components I'm gonna talk about: being seen and heard, feeling left behind and abandoned, experiencing grief and loss, and then learning and post-trauma growth. As I speak about these things, I'd like you to think about them from the interpersonal perspective. How do these things show up for you? How do they show up in our relationships with others, the interpersonal? And then how they show up in our operations and our organization at the organizational level. Also think about how this shows up in yourself, in your colleagues, in your families, in your students, or as the role that you hold. So as administrators, as an educator, as a health service provider, as someone who coordinates and provides transportation and health, so just think about your role. How can you take on this information? Now, I'm talking about healing pathways, and I just want to honor that word itself may resonate differently for people. Know that what I mean about the word healing is the dynamic process between moving from surviving to thriving. It looks different for individuals, and it is a collection of activities and practices and spaces. But I also wonder if you want to resonate for a minute or sit with a minute about, does that even feel like it's part of your job, or is it even part of the function of a school? And I would like you to start to think about what role could you play in promoting resilience and healing and post-trauma growth. And you will hear me say oftentimes that I think it's an important role in order to move towards the ability to learn and to have reasoning, which is part of the education kind of functioning. Maybe your role is to just be aware of these things, to be able to observe them and maybe provide information to people as necessary. Or maybe your environment is safe enough, or because of your role, you can actually engage in activities. So just know awareness is actually a really important beginning. How much you engage with the activities will depend on a lot of things. But let's just think about, can our schools, our classrooms, our front offices, our interactions, all of the things that we do, can they, while focused on education, can they also simultaneously promote resilience and healing? And maybe even need to do that first to get to that reasoning and learning. All right, we're going to jump right in. So being seen and heard. So why is this important? So the reason this is important, having someone bear witness to our experience is important because it makes us not feel alone. And especially with the past year, there's been a lot of isolation and aloneness and othering. Are other people experiencing this? Right? How do I experience this? What does this mean? So by being seen and heard, we don't feel so alone. It also helps us to make meaning, right? To have other people's perspectives and experiences. It helps us develop this kind of shared collective experience. It also, and when we think about this, it's really important because we want to think about, we want to be mindful of the one story that's being shared or the few stories that are being shared, right? Not everyone is experiencing toxic stress, but not everyone is experiencing it the same way. We have disproportional, representation of those who actually who've experienced COVID-19 itself, as well as the impacts of COVID-19. So we want to figure out how can we elevate these stories. We also, in being kind of finding ways to see and hear people and their experience, we also want to listen for and elevate that culture is healing. In my work, a lot of times what we know is like the healing process that people have internally and within their culture and community often have what they need to heal. It's often the system that gets in the way of that. So as we listen for experiences, we want to listen for experiences of potential pain and harm and trauma, but also experiences of resilience and of care and of community and of healing. So as you think about bringing forth this idea of how can you have people be seen and heard in the role that you play, I want you to think again about the why so that people don't feel alone and they can start to make sense of their experience. And the reason I want you to think about the why is that it's not always about me sharing with words, verbally sharing my experience. In fact, in a lot of situations, that won't feel safe. I may not feel safe because I don't feel like I have power in the organization, or because, I don't trust my peers or my teacher to care for whatever the reasons, it may not feel safe. So remember that what you're trying to do is have every person see themselves in different stories. So you could do this by offering readings or videos or sharings of other stories that are already out there. And you want the audience, the person you're in front of, to say, oh, yeah, that's how I felt. Oh, wow, that's how I felt. Right. So just think about how you can do that in a way that is most safe. You can also make just statements, right? So you can acknowledge this. You can stand up in front of a family group or students or staff and say, I want to acknowledge that, we've had different unique experiences during this time. And for some, there's been deep pain and grief. For some, there's been flourishing. And, and so that you're just simply stating that is really important. You could use things like art, right? The expressions through art or creativity is often really powerful because in times of toxic stress, language is challenging and limiting, and sometimes, doesn't feel safe. And so finding ways that you can see your story, you can see your experience in a different way, and in maybe sometimes a safer way. You might just have a bulletin board with examples of how people experience this time so that you can stand back and go, oh, wow, there's a lot of different experiences, and there's a lot of similarity that you may find, or some themes in that. You may guide that process with like a fill in the blank. What have you learned during this time about yourself or work? And then what do you want to let go of? Or what's been hard, and what was something that flourished for you, right? So you could guide that conversation. And then think about using the tools that you probably already have that allow people to have that reflection and conversation, if that's what you choose to do, that's safe. So things like, we're having a moment of reflection. So think about this question, share it in a pair, and then you could share it out if that feels like it makes sense for you. All right, feeling left behind and abandoned. So why do we want to be aware of this feeling of being left behind or abandoned? And it's sometimes called betrayal trauma. And what betrayal trauma is it's actually the experience of when there's been a traumatic, hurtful, harmful incident, when the system fails to care for you in that time. So when the system has failed to care for us in that time, is this idea of abandonment, betrayal trauma. And this may be because it was purposeful, the system purposely failed because the system is flawed, or and because of systemic oppression, racism, and those things, and all the things that impact our systems and its impact on individuals. And it also could be because of a policy, or because there weren't enough monitors to send home, or all the, so a variety of reasons why system failure. But we want to kind of acknowledge that. It could be that you felt left behind by your colleagues, or you felt left behind by the school, or by your peers, or by the district, or by the state, or by the federal government, right? So there are lots of different ways people experience being left behind and abandoned and not cared for. The reason we want to take a moment to maybe explore this is because it is often as hurtful as the incident. So think about that. It's often as hurtful as the incident. So the incident happens, and then the lack of the system's ability to care, see, and hear me can be as hurtful. It brings us awareness of what was ruptured and what may need repair and care as we move into the next phase, next stage. It helps us also to start create a coherent narrative. It's that part of being seen and heard, right? That not everyone experiences in the same way. And it helps us to interpret, because oftentimes in toxic stress, we're very aware of our surrounding, but our interpretation of that surrounding can be different. So as we share these feelings of abandonment or not cared for, we can start to have potentially some resolution, some repair as that moves forward. And again, it's a part of being seen and heard. It's a part of that, the first thing, but it often has to be explicitly asked for, because you almost need permission. So I say to my staff, in what ways during this time have you not felt cared for by me, by the organization, by the university, right? How can we think about that? This is really about validating and listening. So, and think about these things about if they don't happen, if you don't if you don't allow this reflection to happen, how might it show up in different ways, right? So this is about validating, listening, about how I wasn't able to care for my staff in this particular time. And some of those listening things are things that I can do differently next time. It's a learning. And sometimes it's just holding that. It's not about giving excuses. It's not even about taking responsibility and blame if it's not mine to take, right? But it's allowing the conversation. So you also want to think deeply about how might this come forth? What might be the experiences differently about feeling abandoned and left behind, that is grounded in one's identity, grounded in race and gender and language, right? So explicitly bringing that into our understanding. And how you engage with this component of healing is really going to be dependent on your role. And that's really important for you to stop and assess, right? It's going to be dependent on your comfort to hold the space around this. So it may be that you just are aware of it, right? The second thing is you could acknowledge it. And the third is whether you actually are in a position to ask about that. And that's something to assess. So some ways to do this is offering that statement. This is that acknowledging. I'm aware that this time has not and is not being experienced in the same way for everyone. And for many, the system in place have failed to see and hear you and to care for you. So it's a global statement I can make. I can also offer space to listen, right? I'm available from 4 to 5 p.m. to hear how the organization has, however, fill in the blank you want to put in, have not cared for you in this time. And then if you actually are in a position to hear those things, you're collecting that information. And in a safe way, you can figure out ways to address that, to repair, if that can happen. And then also for the next time you're addressing that for next. The third component of healing is grief and loss. Now, why do we bring grief and loss? I think this is, something we've been talking about, but I want to just remind us to bring it into our conversation, because what it does is allow us to take time. This isn't like we're done and now we're here, right? Our healing process, our integration process is going to take time. And I think most of us understand that when we think about grief, that is not kind of something to be done with, but something to experience. And that it comes in different waves, right? And different things activated and different things. We all experience it differently. My grandmother taught me that grief was immensely individual while also being collective. We all have experienced it, and yet we all experience it in different ways. So bring that concept into your thinking right now, to give yourself some grace and some time. Also know it helps us to honor things like anniversaries and activation points that we may not be aware of. It also helps us to remember sometimes our feelings don't feel congruent to the moment, right? Maybe you burst out in tears during a Zoom staff meeting, or maybe the first day back feels really emotional in a way that is surprising to you. I think if you allow yourself to label that as grief and loss, it will normalize that experience, right? I also ask you to consider this concept of disenfranchised grief, which is the experience when there's a loss that cannot be openly acknowledged, it's not socially sanctioned or publicly mourned. And I think this speaks to so much of what's been happening over the past time, over this time with COVID-19, again, as we kind of have this reckoning with racism and uprising. So think about what's not allowed to be publicly mourned and what's not allowed to be socially sanctioned. And so, just offer those words into your understanding. So how can you bring grief, and what are some ideas to bring grief and loss into the space? So one thing is to make sure, right, that the charts you have, feeling charts you have, and this is for staff and for students of all ages, you can decide which one, what they look like is going to make a difference, but that you're putting those words out there, the feelings of grief, right? That you're honoring that. We've already talked about disenfranchised grief. Practice listening around losses without needing to move through it too quickly or making it better, right? Like, oh, that's, our society doesn't do really good job holding space around grief. So being prepared to be like, that was really sad. I hear that you had a really sad experience. I hear that it is really sad right now for you. I hear that you had a big loss, right? So you don't have to fix it, but seeing and hearing and actively listening means a lot. Have designated time for grief, for yourself, for your staff, for your families. That might be a few minutes in every staff meeting to have reflection time. It may be a space in a building where people can have that time. It may be an event, right? Every 3 months, we do this, right? We memorialize. And if we have these regular times, however that looks, it allows us to normalize and to expect, right? Like, okay, I'll hold it. I can hold it right now because I know I'll have this chance to let that go. So think about it that way. You could have writing assignments, right? Bring all of this into all of the aspects that you can, and then make sure you're speaking about loss and the different types of loss people have experienced, from loss of life to loss of celebrations to loss of trips and projects, but also loss of jobs, maybe loss of colleagues and employees who have left, right? Maybe loss of a community and culture in some way. So allow all of that to be present for people, so we're not like doing like that's not a loss, right? Or that doesn't feel like it's a loss because it doesn't fit some list that someone gave me. Okay, identifying post-trauma growth and learning. So post-trauma growth is different from resilience. Resilience in the simplistic form is this bouncing back to. But for many communities who experience systemic oppression, bouncing back to doesn't feel like it's complete or is the goal by any means. And so we want to think about post-trauma growth also. And again, you find the words that speak to you and to the communities you work with. But post-trauma growth is that growth, is that learning and strength and things that change because of thriving, surviving through traumatic and tragic events. So you with maybe change of beliefs and behaviors and et cetera. So a couple reasons why this is important. One is that it promotes integration and growth. So an outcome of experience significant toxic stress is that we become fragmented, and we're like the person who deals with that over here, and then we're going to stop that, and now we're the person over here that's back in school. But we're actually all of those parts, right? And so as we look at post-trauma growth, we start to integrate both the pain and the suffering and the healing and all of the things, and that's the work. So promotes integration. The second thing is that we've been talking a lot about, wow, what do we learn during this process? And what has been exposed by our systems? What do we not want to go back to? And what do we want to encourage? What do we want to keep doing differently, right? But a really important message is it is our instinct to go back to what we know, even if what we know was harmful or hurtful. Often what we know, even if it was harmful or hurtful, is feels not as fearful as the unknown. So we really have to actively work to resist to going back to ways that were harmful, hurtful, or ineffective. So by taking this moment, we're actively resisting that, right? So we need to really pause and take that understanding. And it also helps us realize that there was learning that happened, right? So a couple of ideas to bring this forward in your work is there could be self-reflection. You could just do this at the minimum for yourself. You might also be able to facilitate a reflection on this for families, for students, for staff, where you ask questions like, what have you learned about yourself during this time? What have you learned about your work during this time? What's been exposed? What do you want to take forward? What do we want to let go of, right? Another bulletin board, might be dating myself, but where you can crowdsource ideas of what to keep present and what to carry forward. Because remember, there's a lot that our brains are having to work on right now. There's a lot of toxic stress and things that we're having to do. We're gonna forget. So please document those small things, and also know you may have found a great technique. We want to share that with someone else so people can see, oh, I didn't think about that. What a great idea. And we can hold on to that. We may not continue some of those, but there may be many of those we do want to continue. So documenting that is so very important. All right. So we're going to wrap this up. I hope some of this has resonated to what you may be seeing, what you may be experiencing. As you think about these things, think about, right, these ideas for yourself, for your staff, for your colleagues, and for your families. Healing, right? People often have what they need to heal in their culture, in their community, in their self. And most people are going to be benefited as we give them space to do this, to kind of to roll this out, right? So space, we give people grace to practice maybe new behaviors or to kind of have a moment to transition, right? So space and grace and time, while also having caring, consistent adults in our students' lives and for each other. Caring and consistent peer support is creating the healing space that's necessary for any learning to happen. So thank you very much for your work and for being the buffer.